Hey, thanks, Alan. At Aerojet Rocketdyne, we're really proud to be a sponsor of the Glenn Symposium. Again, and this is the second year now, and we love being part of it. And we have a long history with NASA Glenn, going back through space propulsion, electric propulsion, and in-space power systems. And I want to let you know that I actually have a great personal connection with NASA Glenn because they paid for my master's degree through a fellowship from NASA Glenn, and actually spent 7 months up in Cleveland working on my master's thesis. So that really set the stage for my career. And at Aerojet Rocketdyne, and certainly personally, we are always looking to pay that back and helping people get through school in aerospace and STEM and other activities to advance their education. But right now I want to say it's my pleasure to introduce Janet Karika, who I've known for over 20 years as we have both kind of advanced through our careers, mostly in launch. And she's the principal advisor for space transportation at NASA headquarters. Her topic is evolution of power synergies, how payloads and visions drive launch vehicles. Janet began her service as NASA Chief of Staff in November of 2018. She's a recognized subject matter on space policy, space transportation, and non-proliferation. Before assuming her role as Chief of Staff, she supported NASA Launch Services Program and the NASA Headquarters Human Exploration and Operations Mission Directorate, Launch Services Office, and as a Jacobs Executive Director of Interagency Launch Programs. And I have to mention this because I'm a past president of AIAA. She's an Associate Fellow for the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics. So please welcome Janet.
Thanks, Jim, for that kind introduction. And thanks also to the American Astronautical Society, the NASA Glenn Research Center led by the incomparable Marla Perez Davis, and the symposium sponsors for giving me this opportunity to speak to you today. I also have a tie to Glenn, given that I was born in Cleveland. So I look forward to coming up and visiting Marla and touring Glenn again. It's such an amazing center. So as Jim said, I've been in space transportation a long time. This is my 40th year. I entered the Air Force in 1980. I was an engineer and an acquisition officer. I began my career working upper stages for the Atlas launch vehicle at what was Space Division in LA. Oh, wait, you guys, I gotta turn on my timer because I gotta make sure I don't talk too long. Okay. So I've worked some aspect of space transportation ever since. I can honestly say that looking over all these years, this is absolutely the best time to be part of the space program. And while there's many amazing spacecraft and robotic payloads like Pluto New Horizons, Pluto, and the Mars rovers, especially coming up Mars 2020, for me, launch vehicles are the most exciting part of the space program, being now a Florida girl, obviously. So today I'm going to talk to you about the evolution of launch vehicles for these past 40 years, how and why it happened, and how we can continue to take advantage of the momentum that's growing exponentially in space transportation. This timeline and these stories will be simplified, otherwise we'd be here all day, but this is the basic evolution of these launch vehicles. I've broken this time frame into 3 eras to show how each one contributed to moving forward. The first era is from the 80s to the mid-90s, what I call the era of government vision and payloads. The second era is from the mid-90s to 2010, characterized by government industry partnerships and the growth of commercial payloads. And the third era is from 2010 to today, the era of visionaries and commercial business driving availability. We must respect where we came from, but not be bound by our past. Just because something's been tried in the past and didn't take hold, doesn't mean it can't work in the future with the right confluence of technology, vision, and opportunity. Regular, reliable, and accessible human and robotic space exploration is the goal. Only then will we become truly spacefaring. In the first era, from the 80s through part of the 90s, launch and payloads were dominated by government vision and industry implementation. The government held the power. In the 80s, we were still building government rockets, both for civil and national security purposes, predominantly under cost-plus contracts. On the civil side, NASA's space shuttle was just starting flying. On the national security side, the Air Force was both building rockets and still pulling ICBMs out of the ground and renovating them to be used as launch vehicles. GPS was still in development, with the first GPS Navstar satellite prototype launching in 1978, just 2 years before I arrived at Space Division in LA, and I became the GPS Navstar stage vehicle engineer. The two main government spacefaring entities even then were the National Security Space Sector, composed of the Air Force and the then secretive National Reconnaissance Office, or NRO, and the civil sector led by NASA. And even though there was a time frame when the space shuttle needed missions to help close their business case and the Air Force was directed to scrap their launch vehicles and fly on space shuttles, the Challenger accident caused the Air Force to return to using traditional rockets, and the two sectors stayed pretty much in their lanes after that. While somewhat duplicative, it was pretty useful given the fledgling nature of space at the time. In many ways, this led to much more innovation than if there was only one team working together on space transportation. And there was some cross-flow between NASA and the Air Force. For example, I was one of the first women who was part of the NASA Exchange Scientist program, where the Air Force and NASA exchanged scientists and engineers so they could learn from each other. There was also collaboration between the Air Force and NASA on launch vehicle development, like the launch vehicle that became the Delta II, and for launch operations, such as NASA's use of the Air Force Titan IV for Cassini. While commercial satellites had been around since the early 60s, originally for television broadcasts and then communications and weather, they hadn't produced tremendous revenue yet. This era of government vision for delivery of government astronauts and government payloads like GPS, coupled with the significant government funding necessary for these early attempts, kept the government as the power center. However, programs like GPS paved the way for the next era of launch vehicle development. Developing systems like GPS showed the potential for commercial applications of space technology. Space transportation was poised to take the next step in evolution. The next era, from the mid-90s to 2010, saw commercial space investment grow tremendously and drove how we acquired launch vehicles and why. By the early 2000s, global investment in space was around $50 billion. GPS had become fully operational in the mid-90s and was a game changer, and not just in the capability to navigate for military purposes. Once commercial industry found ways to bring it to the general public, the use of GPS became commonplace, and a profitable personal navigation industry was born. From maritime to general aviation to space navigation, GPS changed the way we worked and lived. This commercial application was the strongest example at the time of the commercial potential for space activities. With use of commercial satellites on the rise, launch vehicles needed to be more affordable if industry was going to use them. Using industry interest in launch vehicle affordability, the Air Force got permission for a new launch vehicle development program called the Evolved Expendable Launch Vehicle Program, or EELV. And it was going to replace vehicles like the Air Force Titan IV with a more affordable heavy lift capability. Many contractors competed to be chosen to develop these new launchers. They saw the promise of a growing commercial satellite market. They wanted to win commercial satellite launches back from Russia and China, where they'd started to go, and they wanted to compete for government business. While it's a long story on how we got to two EELV launch providers, the most interesting thing about this launch vehicle development was that it was acquired through something called an OTA, or an Other Transactions Authority. It was the largest OTA in the government's history at the time. NASA's Space Act agreement is the closest corollary for the civil field. It was done on firm fixed price, performance-based milestones, with the two winning contractors, Lockheed Martin with their Atlas family, and Boeing with their Delta IV family of launch vehicles, getting $500 million each to use as they saw fit, with government concurrence, to develop a family of launch vehicles that would meet a medium and a heavy lift performance. It was fielded by a small program office in LA at what was renamed from Space Division to the Space and Missile Systems Center, and I was the Air Force Director for launch programs in Washington. This program was run with government insight, not direction, and balanced the power between the government and the contractors. And on the collaboration front, NASA was brought in during the requirements definition to make sure all spacecraft needs were enveloped. The Air Force specified medium and heavy lift capabilities these new evolved launch vehicles required. However, the contractors decided the sweet spot in the commercial market required a more flexible intermediate lift capability. The contractors each separately developed versions with differing amounts of strap-on solid rocket motors that could be tailored to fit a customer's unique lift requirements. We call them dialer rockets. Less solids cost you less, but meant you needed to manage your satellite weight budget carefully. They filed their own environmental impact statements for solid rocket use. They funded the development of this intermediate category essentially on their own. Both contractors felt there was a robust commercial market out there, and they would be able to recoup their investment. It changed everything. Without the industry vision for the intermediate class of vehicles, we'd be flying either a small satellite on a medium or a giant satellite on a heavy version of EELV. Instead, the intermediate class became the workhorse for the EELV era, especially for the government. The EELV business model was hugely different than anything we'd ever attempted before, and I'm incredibly proud of both these systems to this day. They have been the lift for the nation for a long time, and many people forget how innovative this acquisition approach was at the time. EELV also ushered in a new level of collaboration between NASA, the NRO, and the Air Force, which helped keep the EELV program on track. The teams began working together to leverage their resources while staying focused on their particular mission's payload requirements. Each had different approaches, but they met regularly and compared notes. We always likened it to having someone check your homework before you turn it in. The agencies worked together to present one face to the contractor as much as possible, so as not to drive cost or unmet risk into the launch vehicle, or to have the company try to satisfy conflicting requirements. But despite its benefits, EELV met with tremendous resistance among the old guard. This program was under attack from the start. From the Air Force IG to the GAO, we seemed to be always under some sort of audit or investigation. Overseers could not understand how we could not track every taxpayer dollar, even though we would patiently explain that we determined what a fair price was for every milestone met, and if they met the milestone with the government's concurrence, they would get paid regardless of what it cost them to actually meet that milestone. The budgeteers couldn't incrementally tax the program because we had to pay the agreed firm fixed price amounts for the work completed. So we weren't super popular with the big account managers either. And Space Command wasn't happy with us because it became too easy for satellites to grow because they just had to add another solid rocket motor. But in the end, we successfully fielded the program, essentially on time, on budget, on performance in 4 years. After that, the two contractors competed continuously for missions, and I feel we got great prices because of it. And the nation got two outstanding launch vehicle families. None of this would have been possible without industry finding ways to profit from the commercial satellite market, driving them to develop launch systems that were more affordable and flexible. This allowed the government to leverage competition and keep the prices down. As I said, the boom in the commercial market was the philosophy at the time. But as most of you know, the market never materialized in the way we all hoped. Commercial satellites continued to go overseas to a much cheaper foreign government subsidized launch vehicles. And these two contractors eventually consolidated their launch vehicle organizations into the company now called United Launch Alliance, who continue to launch the nation's satellites with 100% mission success. However, our great commercial launch industry was still on the horizon. Now we're entering the third era from 2010 to today, which is driven heavily by commercial launch visionaries and commercial payloads. Regarding these visionaries, the biggest change agent with respect to launch vehicles was the reintroduction of reusability. I maintain that no one in the government would have implemented reusability. There was simply no requirement for it. There was research done on flyback boosters. A lot of government people wrote papers on it, but our only foray into operational reusability as a government at the time was the space shuttle. Its goal was to produce a system that was both affordable and able to be rapidly refurbished so it could launch every few weeks. Unfortunately, as we know, refurbishment took longer, cost more than we thought. The amount of payloads didn't emerge. It was more difficult. So while the potential benefits of space shuttle reusability was correct, the technology and the business case was not ready to fully take advantage of a reusable space transportation system. So enter the commercial visionaries. When Elon Musk's company SpaceX came on the horizon and started their launch vehicle designs from the outset with reusability in mind, many of the new old guard in national security and civil space scoffed. It's been tried before. It's never as reusable as you think it is. We'll never be able to certify it. What many missed in those early days was that this reusability was driven not for affordability as a goal in and of itself. Affordability and reusability was necessary because the goal of that visionary was to eventually develop launch systems that can colonize other worlds. And there was the promise of another intrinsic aspect of reuse, reliability. Rather than reused rockets being more risky, some argued that they are more reliable because they've already flown successfully. Truly a mind-stretching thought for the old guard, myself this time included. And the game changer for reusability to finally be fully feasible was technology. Technology had caught up to the reusability vision. Now, make no mistake about it, the government played a key role in those early days to aid in the success of this renewed vision. Cargo resupply services by NASA is a great example. That program employed risk-tolerant payloads that could be launched to the International Space Station with innovative launch technologies like reusability. During this time, other commercial visionaries were introducing new large-scale engines like Jeff Bezos' company Blue Origin's BE-4, fueled by methane. And that would be used in either their New Glenn launch vehicle or in ULA's new Vulcan launch vehicle. This is another innovation that was created with reusability in mind. This vision, this visionary's vision, is millions of people living and working in space. This engine development would not have been fielded by the government at that time. So SpaceX and Blue Origin and other new launch companies and their leaders pushed to make reusability something government not only could, but wanted to incorporate into their acquisitions. In addition to visionaries who had unique requirements for launch vehicles, the way payloads were adapting also drove how the government funded and acquired launch vehicles in this era. Small payloads were performing more and more vital missions and needed rapid integration. So on the smaller scale, for example, NASA's Launch Services Program developed something called the Venture Class Launch Service, or VCLS, in collaboration with the Science Mission Directorate and the Space Technology Mission Directorate. It was designed to see whether a small launch vehicle company with little government involvement, but some, could develop a launch vehicle within a specified amount of time for a price. It had its fits and starts, but in the end proved that this type of launch vehicle could be utilized with the right balance of risk, and it helped usher in companies like Rocket Lab. Now DARPA and the Air Force are working on similar programs. The need to fly experimental small mission and student-led payloads has driven more than just VCLS. The Commercial Lunar Payload Service, or CLPS, is using a similar concept. The EELV Secondary Payload Adapter, or ESPA ring, was designed and developed by the Air Force for the EELV program. Now at NASA, the Science Mission Directorate flies ESPA rings on their science missions. As we look forward to the future in this era, there will be more and more innovative ways commercial industry can provide space transportation services to both industry and government, and less need for deep government oversight, but always enough to make sure we're getting the best value for the taxpayer, which is not always the cheapest, it's best value, and those are different things. In this era, unique government requirements, however, are still valid. And at times the government needs to generate a capability to meet its requirements, such as a unique heavy lift for the NRO, or human spaceflight requirements for our Moon-Mars missions, like our Artemis program. Not everything can and should be commercial. There are always unique test facilities and lab capabilities that the government possesses, like a Glenn Research Center, that can and should be used for development. Great examples of this are the government assets that are being made available for the Human Lander System companies, or the uniqueness of the V2 test stand for the SLS rocket, or the testing of the Delta IV R68 engines in Stennis. Also, government involvement adds value in improving contractor launch vehicle designs through insight and collaborative anomaly investigations. I know pretty much every launch company at this point, and I can tell you that they will all say that government involvement has helped them in their designs and in their implementations. That experience is invaluable. But with all that said, I still feel the commercial market should be heavily leveraged to maximize the taxpayers' investment in our space programs. This era that commercial visionaries and new payloads provides many innovations that the government can benefit from. And this leads me to another key thing I've learned from my years in acquisition. Governments must write future launch vehicle requirements with as much flexibility and openness as possible to meet a mission need. And even more important and harder to do When government evaluators do get proposals back, they must be open to the innovations they may have not expected and may not have wanted, but they have to embrace them and see if there is a way to incorporate those to meet mission requirements. Only then can launch vehicle technology leap forward. So there were lessons learned from the past as the government moved to embrace new ways of acquiring space transportation capabilities. As I was first learning about NASA's cargo resupply services and then commercial crew, I was like, Space Act Agreement, small program office, light government touch, performance-based milestones. So over time, I was NASA's advisor at the time. I shared a lot of the lessons learned, chaired panels, brought people back from EELV to talk to NASA about the lessons learned and the hardships we had and the ways that we managed the program to help them. And I think it did help. So that's another example of how those kinds of past lessons learned can really help us. So in summary, in the beginning, the government held all the power. We paid contractors to build what we needed. They had accounting systems that served our purposes so we could prove we had best value to the taxpayer. Then the commercial market changed the way we acquired space transportation. The government and industry became more like partners, like a power duo. Now with the advent of commercial satellites, industries want to use space to make a profit and advance their vision for humanity. We've moved to a place where industry is the power center, developing launch vehicles to meet their own goals in space, and government is leveraging this space transportation to meet its goals as well. The big change is that it's not just about government requirements anymore. We're a part of the overall drive for our nation to become truly spacefaring, to more fully understand the universe around us and the planet we live on. Industry now provides human spaceflight opportunities, robotic spacecraft, navigation, communications, and remote sensing satellites. Someday there'll be commercial human exploration of other worlds. The space transportation industry needs to embrace the change and enthusiasm that comes with this new era of visions and commercial payloads, while keeping the hard-won solid disciplines and lessons learned of the past always in mind, and making sure that the cutting-edge technologies that only government can fund still are preserved and maintained so that we continue to move forward in synergy with each other. We are now in an era where true collaboration can help us reach goals neither government nor industry could have achieved separately. And this will allow our nation's launch vehicles to continue to transform and enable our access to space for years to come. And thank you so much for your time, and I'm happy to take any questions you may have. And then Alan, I just have a couple words at the end. That's it.
Janet, thank you very much. We do have some questions, at least a couple. We're going to try not to go too far over.
Yeah.
But the first question we have is, how concerned are you about the U.S. launch vehicle industry versus the up-and-coming international launch capability?
Well, I think as long as we stay affordable and responsive, I think that we'll compete very well. We've seen indications of this with SpaceX. We've seen a lot of great international collaboration, but companies like Rocket Labs that has worked with us to develop even on the small scale. I think we'll compete quite well. I know we're always fighting against lower cost launch, but that's what gets into best value, right? And best value is important depending on the necessity you have to get your payloads to orbit. So I think a lot of our US launch industry offers the best value because it's coupled with our government insight and our government help. And I really feel like we provide a very compelling product for satellite companies that want to ensure that they get launched.
Okay, thank you. And you talked a little bit about Rocket Lab,
Mm-hmm.
and we've got them as a small launch provider under a reasonably new contract to NASA. And we've got another number of other people like Virgin coming into that environment and that market. How do you see the interfaces going between the satellite constellation community and the launch vehicle community? And are we going to be able to develop enough launch vehicles to satisfy the satellite constellation community external to government capabilities?
Well, one of the things you can look at, obviously, Starlink is a good example in a way. Reusability helps with a high ops tempo. Reusability, when you can turn your rockets quickly and you don't have to be constantly manufacturing, tens and 20s of engines constantly, and you can reuse what you have, refurb and reuse. I think that's going to help a lot. I think also the commercial launch companies in particular are finding ways to both award and integrate and field these satellites in much shorter times. You used to take really long times to integrate satellites, and now we're finding shorter and shorter timeframes to do that, and standardized buses and standardized things that help us really almost off the shelf fly a lot of satellites with very little lead time. So Alan, I don't know if this is answering the question, but I really feel that the key to this is the ability to rapidly award and integrate your payloads. I remember Ariane was at one point was able to, they were saying 6 months, 6 to 9 months, you're on the vehicle. And so I think that's one of the keys to being responsive to the satellite market. It's a nice problem to have, right? We didn't always have that in the beginning. So the ranges are being incredibly responsive as well. They're looking at ways that they can turn missions very, very quickly. So we're working with the ranges because it takes infrastructure too, right? You have to have the right infrastructure to support all that. So I think that we just have to continue to be more and more responsive, and we have to use what we have rather than continuing to build new things. Does that answer?
Thank you. You got it. And thank you very much. We don't very often get to hear from people who lived it and people who were experts in it, take us from in the beginning to where we are today with perhaps a large number of commercial launch providers providing to commercial, let me repeat that again, commercial payloads. So thank you very much. And if I had a way to clap for you, I'd clap for you, but there's no way to do it here.
One quick thing to say, if I may.
Go ahead.
So tomorrow is the anniversary of the handshake across the airlock with Apollo-Soyuz. And I will tell you that for me, it was not Apollo 11 that got me into the space program. It was as a young girl, middle of the Cold War, watching those two gentlemen shake hands across an airlock. And it meant the world to me. And it showed what a unifying thing space could be for the planet. And that's why I wanted to be part of it. And I think that as we move forward as a nation and as a planet, space is a team sport, and it is hard enough that we all have to work together to make it happen. And it is important to make it happen. We are explorers by nature. And I just tip a beverage tomorrow to those two amazing crews. And it's been my high honor to know General Stafford now. And that was a really big turning point for me. So just keep them in mind as tomorrow hits. So that's all I had to say. Thank you guys for your time.
Thank you, Janet.